do that. Let's get into the Book of Ruth. Now, last week I did an introduction to the Book of Ruth, and we taught chapter 1 through verse 18. And so that's where through verse 18. So that's where I want to pick it up. For those of you, just a quick refresher. Ruth is, a man named Elimelech took his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, and he went over to Moab. And I'd like to share my screen again. I want to refresh us on the geography, just because the geography is really, really important when it comes to these type of things. And let's see, I'm going to blow this up a little bit so we can see it a little better. And so here is Bethlehem. All right, where'd you get off to? So here's Bethlehem of Judah, and this is where Naomi and Elimelech and their sons Mahlon and Chilion were from, or Mahlon and Chilion, and they, during a famine in the land, went over here to Moab. And so here's Moab. So as you can see, as the crow flies, they didn't travel very far, but they would have had to walk up and around the Dead Sea. It's very unlikely that they would have gone down into the Edomite territory and walked through this desert. That would be really, really tough traveling through the desert, as the children of Israel discovered. So with that, in Moab, Elimelech passed away, as did his two sons, and Naomi became very bitter. They heard that the famine was over in the land of Israel, so Naomi decided to go back with her two daughters-in-law following her, except she then encouraged the daughters-in-law to turn back, go back to Moab, and Orpah did, and Ruth clung to Naomi. And as we pick it up here in Ruth chapter 1, verse 19, we're in a situation where Ruth has just been very honest with Naomi, starting in verse 16. And Naomi has now decided, okay, Ruth, you can go with me. But Naomi, again, is very broken and bitter. And so in verse 19, it says, and the two of them, this is Ruth and Naomi, went on until they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass, when they came to Bethlehem, that the whole city was astir about them. And the women said, is this Naomi? Now, a lot of the versions, if you're reading a version, says, and they said, or they asked, and the they there is a feminine plural. So this is talking about the women, and that would be natural, because here's Ruth and Naomi, and they're coming into Bethlehem, and who's really paying attention to them? Who's really interested in them and what's going on in their life? The other women of the village would be. And so here the women asked, is this Naomi? And it's it's not a question in the sense that they didn't know it was Naomi. I mean, they knew it was Naomi, but Naomi left with a husband, and she left with two sons, and apparently they were at least sort of prosperous because Elimelech had some land. And here comes Naomi, and where's her husband, and where are her sons, and who's this Moabite woman that's in tow? And so when they said, is this Naomi, it's really a reflection of the fact that Naomi wasn't her old self, so to speak, that Naomi had changed. And obviously 10 years had aged her, but also just what happens in your visage when you're constantly disappointed, and the fact that her children, her sons had died, her husband had died, she was very bitter. And then this comes out immediately. Here's Naomi talking to these women that she hasn't seen for 10 years. So there's got to be a lot to talk about. And what happens is this bitterness just pours forth out of her, and she's going to make 4 very quick accusations against Yahweh God. So they said, is this Naomi? Or there's a lot of different ways. If you were doing the paraphrase or an expanded version, it might be something like, is this Naomi? What the heck happened to you? Something like that. That's the essence of what's going on here. Verse 20, she said to them, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter. And then she says, and here's why I'm bitter. And it's very interesting now what she's going to do, because, and she probably said a lot more than this, and God kind of distilled this down for us. I mean, obviously, she didn't just talk for 2 sentences. I mean, she and the women would have talked a very long time, but it gets distilled down into this chewy caramel center, if you will. And she starts out with the Almighty, and then Yahweh, and then Yahweh, and then the Almighty. So there's a very interesting introversion here that puts an emphasis on what she's saying. So she starts out and she says, the Almighty, Shaddai, which is, stands for Yahweh, the Almighty. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me, or dealt very harshly, or dealt in a way that's caused me to be bitter. So this is what she starts out with right away. It's not that, gosh, life is tough and there's no promises we're going to do well or whatever. She goes right to the chewy caramel center, that somehow or other God is responsible for this, which is what's happening today. Now, it was even understandable sort of in the Old Testament, because God did portray himself in charge of events in the Old Testament. But for a person in the New Testament church to talk like this, it's just really inexcusable, and shows that somebody doesn't understand the text and what the Bible is revealing to us about the war between good and evil, and the fact that God is a God of love. But she starts out, the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, meaning, I had money, I had a husband, I had sons, and Yahweh has brought me home again empty. And this is, boy, when we talk about an offense against a brother, there's so many written and unwritten lessons in the book of Ruth. And when we talk about, if a brother offends you, and we go to Matthew 18 and we say, the first thing you do is you talk to the person personally. And then the second thing you do is you talk to the person in front of a couple witnesses. And then the third thing you do is you talk in front of the entire congregation. And then the fourth thing you do is you excuse the person from your life or from your fellowship. But there's a first part that is mentioned in a couple other places in the Bible that isn't mentioned in Matthew 18. And that is, the first thing you do is overlook what the person said. Just, it doesn't matter. It's not about me. It's about them and their heart. And you simply overlook it. And this shows up in verses like in Ecclesiastes, where it says, don't pay attention to every word that everybody says, because you yourself know that you at times have cursed others. So, just let it go. So if you want to, if you want to be peaceful in your heart, if you don't want to be angry all the time, one of the things you have to learn is how to let things go that people say or do. They're people, they're human, they make mistakes, they're foolish, they do all kinds of weird things. Let it go. Boy, if you're prickly and you're upset by everything people say and do, then you're going to be prickled your entire life. And so when you can imagine, here's Ruth standing there, and Ruth has just shown great dedication to Yahweh and to Naomi, and Naomi says, Yahweh brought me home empty. Now, see, Ruth could have immediately just, well, if that's the way you feel, I'm out of here, and she just let it go. Guys, I'm telling you, if we're prickly, your life is going to be miserable. You're always going to be prickled. The first lesson in interpersonal relationships is people are stupid. They make stupid mistakes. They say things they don't mean. Do what Ecclesiastes says, let it go. And that's exactly what Ruth does. There's no indication at all that this changed Ruth's attitude toward Naomi, even though it's pretty apparent from what Naomi said at that point, she wasn't feeling like Ruth was worth much. But of course, we know she didn't feel completely that way. And then she says, secondly, why do you call me Naomi, since Yahweh has testified against me? And she says Yahweh's testified against her because Yahweh had been some kind of witness that and acted so that she came home empty. And then she closes out with, the Almighty has afflicted me. So the Almighty dealt bitterly with her. Yahweh brought her home empty. Yahweh testified against her. The Almighty has afflicted her. She hadn't seen these ladies in 10 years, and this just pours out of her soul. Again, in the Old Testament, there's no command like we have in the New Testament to put away bitterness. There are statements in the Old Testament about the value of a cheerful heart, but there's no command not to be bitter. We in the New Testament church, we have a command: get rid of bitterness. So we need to do that and follow that if we're going to be living in thankfulness always, like the New Testament says to do the epistles. And then the last statement, verse 22, is a summary statement. It says, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, and again, it's going to keep the chapter, and the book of Ruth is going to keep pointing out that she's from Moab. This is done over and over again in the book of Ruth, so that we always kind of keep in mind that she's a Moabite. And again, that's to set a lot of the tone of the background, because at that time between the law of Moses, Deuteronomy, which says a Moabite couldn't enter the congregation, the fact that the Moabites had tried to seduce the Israelites into sexual idolatry when they came out of Egypt, the fact that Eglon, the Moabite, had come across the Jordan River and enslaved the people of Israel, particularly southern Israel, for 18 years. Moabites were not liked at this time in history, and it keeps reminding us of this, so that the actions of Boaz jump out a little more clearly. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned with her out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. And these little details really help us out, because the barley harvest was, generally speaking, in April. Almost always our April. The barley harvest was the very first thing harvested in Israel. It was ahead of the wheat, ahead of the millet, ahead of the flax. It was ahead of the fruits and the vegetables, and it was generally the very first thing that was harvested. And this becomes important in the chronology of Ruth. And we'll see that as we keep reading in Ruth. So let's go to Ruth chapter 2. And so Ruth chapter 2, verse 1 says, Naomi had a relative of her husband, a man of noble character of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Now, we did a lot of study on the Hebrew phrase that gets translated noble character here. It typically got understood in Christian history as a man of wealth. And and you could see that, why it would be that way from the context. He clearly had fields. He clearly had a family. He clearly had servants that worked for him. So was he a wealthy man? Yes. Is that what this text is pointing out? And as we read the book of Ruth, it's not Boaz's wealth that's important. And so you've got a phrase in Hebrew that can mean he was wealthy. It can also mean he was a great warrior in an army. It can also mean he's a very noble person. This, by the way, is the masculine form of the word, or from the masculine form from the same root, where it says, who can find a virtuous woman, in Proverbs 31:10. So here we understand from the scope of Ruth, as well as the latitude, if you will, the semantic range allowed by the Hebrew, that this is talking about Boaz being a man of noble character. And he's of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And we don't really know what the word Boaz means. We have some ideas, and that it's somehow related to the word strength. But there's a lot of scholarly debate on that too. So Ruth chapter 2, verse 1 introduces us to Boaz. Now, one of the things that just shines out of the book of Ruth is the way Boaz shows up as a man of character, a man of noble character, and particularly it shows up in the way he's going to treat Ruth the Moabitess, Ruth the woman from Moab. She's the lady from Moab. And, you know, what could be some of the background that could produce this in a man who lived in an area that not too long before that was oppressed by the Moabites for 18 years? In biblical parlance, I mean, basically a full generation, as women typically got married 12 to 14, men at 15 to 16, something like that. And so to be oppressed for 18 years was, you know, from the time a guy was born until he got married and beyond. And to understand that, we've got to go to Matthew chapter 1. Now, the genealogy of Ruth and Boaz and the genealogy of Pharez is given 4 times in the Bible. It's given here in Ruth, it's given in Chronicles, it's given in Matthew, it's given in Luke. It's always the same all 4 times. But in going to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, we learn something about Boaz that doesn't occur in any of the other 3 genealogies and doesn't occur anywhere else actually in the scripture. And so this is very interesting that Matthew would have to get this by revelation. It may have been passed down in the culture. It may have been generally talked about in the culture, but there's so many things in the culture that just are expansions or they're lies or exaggerations or whatever they are, just untruths that have crept into. I think, for example, just come right to mind, you know, how many wise men came to the birth of Christ? You know, tradition 3, we know there weren't 3 and they didn't come to the birth of Christ. They showed up a year and a half later on the scene. But there's so many Christians that believe that. And so you always have to be careful of tradition. But for Matthew to write by revelation in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, it says, and Salmon fathered Boaz. So we know who Boaz's father was from this genealogy and from Luke and from Chronicles and from the book of Ruth itself. So we know that Salmon was the father of Boaz, but here in Matthew, it's the only time it says who was the mother.
Rahab.
Rahab is the mother. I tell you, this stuff, you know, it's amazing because, you know, here's Rahab the Canaanite who was a prostitute. We don't know why she was a prostitute. She very easily in that sexually oppressive culture could have been forced into it. She could have been forced into it for economic reasons. We don't really know, but somehow or other, we know about her sterling character from the book of Joshua. And she was a woman of sterling character, and she raised a son of sterling character. You know, and there was that saying a while back, we haven't heard it in a long time since women now usually go to work, but, you know, the standard saying that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. It's been well known historically that women had such an influence in raising their children. And here's Rahab the harlot, a woman of sterling character, who married this guy Salmon, who was in the army of Joshua. And then later on, she's going to give birth to Boaz. And then Boaz, he is like his mother, a man of, you know, she was a woman of great character, and he is a man of great character, and no prejudice. And that shows up here in this book, and his love and concern for foreigners, because I'm sure his mother took a lot of pressure in her life, being a Canaanite in the middle of Israel, or the middle, you know, especially in the area of Judah. So anyway, his name was Boaz. And verse 2, so I'm back to the book of Ruth, and in Ruth chapter 2, verse 2 then, and Ruth the Moabitess, there she is again. The text will not let you forget that Ruth is a Moabitess. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go into the field and glean. And you'd say, well, you know, that's a responsibility that as a young woman Ruth would have. Why is she asking her mother's permission? Because she's a Moabitess, because Naomi would, if anything were to happen to her, which frankly Like I say, there was a lot of cultural animosity toward Moabites at this time. Something very easily could have happened to Ruth. There was no cell phones, no communication. Ruth walks out the door in the morning. She's not going to return until probably after dark. And Naomi's going to just sit around and bite her nails all day saying, I hope nothing bad happened to Ruth. And so Ruth understands the angst that Naomi's under when Ruth walks out the door. Her husband died unexpectedly, her sons died unexpectedly, and here's Ruth the Moabitess walking out into conservative Israel at this point. So Ruth understands, and I love the fact she wants to support Naomi, but she's got to also make sure that she and Naomi can eat. And so she says, please let me go into the field and glean among the ears of grain behind him in whose eyes I find favor. There's so much in this. Again, behind him, because the gleaners had to wait until the harvest was taken out and all that was left were the gleanings, the droppings on the ground. And that's why she says, let me glean behind him and in whose eyes I find favor. And even though the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 24, Leviticus 19, Leviticus 23, even though the law of Moses made it clear in at least 3 different places that the poor were allowed to glean the fields, this is the period of Judges when every man does that which is right in his own eyes, and the Moabites weren't liked. So she could well expect to have been driven out of field after field after field. Try to glean here, get out of here, you Moabite, throw some rocks at her, drive her away, go to the next field, throw some rocks at her, drive her away, go to the next field. Gosh. The tension and the worry, gosh, Ellen, your prophecy tonight was so amazing. I see your worries and fears. I have taken care of things in a way you could never understand. Man, that is all over the Book of Ruth. That prophecy is all over the Book of Ruth. And I see your worries and your fears. And Ruth was probably worried. Naomi was decidedly worried. Ruth had asked permission to leave. But Ruth and Naomi knew the harsh reality of life. If you don't eat, you die. And so she had to go out, and so Naomi said to her, go, my daughter. Verse 3, so she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. So now what we know from Bethlehem is the fields, the best fields around Bethlehem are to the east, and they're a slightly lower elevation than the town of Bethlehem. So she walks out of Bethlehem, walking downtown or downhill. We'll see that later as she goes back up into the city. So she's walking downhill, walking to the east, and there are these fields that spread out there. And so it says she came and gleaned in the field, and after the reapers, of course, as a gleaner, she would not be allowed to be where the reapers were. She had to be after them and after they had cleaned things out. And then it says, and she happened to come onto the allotted portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family Elimelech. And the Hebrew is very hard to translate here without making the English sound funny, because the Hebrew reads something like, and her happening was to happen, or her chancing was to chance onto a field. So in other words, from Ruth's perspective, she goes out, she sees some people harvesting. It's a nice looking field. It's got a lot of grain on it. Somebody obviously did a good job of sowing seed with plenty of seed and took care of the ground right. So it's a great field for reaping. And so from her perspective, this is pure chance. Her chancing was to chance upon a field. Her happening was to happen upon a field. But from God's perspective, he's got his hand all over this. You and I have to have faith in that. Ellen's prophecy, I see your worries of fear. I've taken care of things in ways you could never understand. And God does. And we have to pray. And like another prayer or prophecy said about being a teammate with God, that God's on a team. Yeah, it was a prophecy. We're a team, God said. We pray. If we fail to pray, we're not doing our part. We can't expect a lot. But if we're on our knees, if we're staying in prayer, if we're obeying scripture when it says pray without ceasing, devote yourself to prayer in Colossians, praying always in the Spirit in Ephesians, if we're doing our part in praying, then God's doing his part. And here, Ruth's doing the best she can. She goes out to glean. She gets to a field, and she by chance chanced upon an allotted portion of the field to the east that belonged to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. She didn't know who Boaz was. She didn't know who owned the field. She just started gleaning. And we'll learn a little bit more later. At verse 4, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And this tells you that this field is not just like, 100 yards outside the city. This is a bit of a walk to get to these fields. It may have been a mile or so, could have been a little more even. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And the word behold catches our attention, and it points to the time that Ruth is there gleaning. The chances are that Boaz didn't visit his fields every day, but he did this day. And so, behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, Yahweh be with you. And they said, Yahweh bless you. And so here we begin to see, we're getting our first glimpse of Boaz's noble character. We'll see much more about his noble character as the book of Ruth develops. But we're beginning to see a little bit about Boaz's noble character because he speaks to the reapers and he says, Yahweh be with you. In other words, he doesn't just go, look at them and go, yep, they're my workers and walk on. He goes there, he makes personal contact. That's great character. And the fact that he would say Yahweh tells you this is before the Jews decided that you couldn't pronounce the word Yahweh. You see the word Yahweh being used in direct address. The idea of the Jews that, you can't pronounce the word Yahweh, you can't say the word Yahweh. That came much later in Jewish history. And frankly, I think it's a law that's very hurtful because if you're doing the Hebrew, sometimes you can parse and realize that it's talking about the name of God and not a title. But in English, particularly if you're listening to somebody read where they just say Lord for Yahweh and Lord for Adonai and that kind of thing, there's no way to tell when God's personal name is being used. But here Yahweh is being used. So Boaz's noble character shows up and he says, Yahweh be with you. And you can tell they're blessed to have a job. They're blessed to work for him. They're blessed to work for a good man. And they just respond, Yahweh bless you. And it's wonderful to work a good job in a good environment for good people. And these people were obviously reflecting that. Boaz comes right to him, Yahweh with you. They say, well, Yahweh bless you, Boaz. And then Boaz said to his young man who was set over the reapers, because you want to have a foreman. Boaz had a foreman. And he said to the young man who was over his reapers, whose young woman is this? So obviously Ruth immediately walks down to the field and there's a young woman that he hasn't seen before. And so he immediately says, whose young woman is this? And notice, see, if this was today's culture, he would say something like, who is she? Or, who is that? But he doesn't say that. He said, whose young woman is this? Because every young woman, in order to be safe and successful, belonged to somebody. You were either a wife or you were a daughter or you were part of a clan. But, in other words, what Boaz is asking is, who's taking care of this young woman? Whose is she? Does she have a husband? Does she have a father? And that's very cultural and very important to pick up on that. Whose young woman is this? Verse 6, and the young man who was set over the reapers answered and said, she's the Moabite woman. Here we go again. She's the Moabite woman. Now it's also possible, here Ruth shows up and she's allowed by law to glean. She's allowed by the law of Moses to glean. So this guy who is a reflection of Boaz, if Boaz has noble character, he's going to hire people that have noble character, and particularly his leaders, his foremen in this case, are going to reflect his ideals. If they don't, he's going to fire them and get somebody else. And so when Ruth comes and asks to glean, he's going to be, hey, as far as I can see, you're a young woman, you're poor, you're a widow. Yeah, you can glean. Law of Moses says in at least 3 different places you can glean. There it is. There's the field. But notice that he likely doesn't know her name at this point. He wouldn't be concerned enough about her to ask her name. This is the foreman, and the law of Moses wouldn't require him to. The law of Moses says she's poor, she's a widow, she can glean. He's like, okay, you're poor, you're a widow, you can glean. But he wouldn't take a personal interest, except to know that, well, she's that she's the young woman who returned with Naomi from the country of Moab, which he might have heard in his, as his family got together, and, very likely his wife and maybe daughters and everybody else knew all about Ruth and Naomi. So she says that, he's with she's that Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the country of Moab. Verse 7, and she said, please let me glean. And that's, again, see, Ruth, as a Moabite woman, was probably very concerned that she would be driven out of a lot of fields. So she went, before she started, she went and she asked, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. And that'd be exactly right. She wouldn't be with the reapers because the reapers are reaping the harvest. She would be behind them picking up the gleanings. So she came and has continued from morning until now. She's been sitting a little while in the shelter, and I'm not going to go into the dispute in the Hebrew about whether she had been sitting in the shelter. There's a lot of dispute about how this Hebrew phrase is to be translated, whether she was currently sitting in the shelter, whether she had been sitting in the shelter, something like that. So basically, as far as we were able to tell from the Hebrew, that at the time that Boaz showed up and was asking these questions, she was taking a little break in the shelter. And basically the foreman noticed her work ethic and said she's been working from morning until now. And Boaz walks up to her. Whew. And see, here we get another glimpse at Moab's character, because Boaz, in those cultures, if you were part of a clan, you knew you were part of a clan. As soon as the young man, Boaz's foreman, said, well, she's with Naomi, Boaz would have immediately known that he was a relative of Elimelech, and he had some kind of social responsibility to help take care of Naomi, especially since her 2 sons were dead. And so all of a sudden he's got an interest in this young woman who's harvesting and obviously is going to bring this grain home to Naomi. And so Boaz walks up to Ruth and starts to talk to her. And he says, listen carefully, my daughter. Now, the Hebrew uses an idiom, have you not heard? But that's very confusing in English. And it seems to mean in this context, listen carefully. So he says, listen carefully, my daughter. And the fact that he calls her my daughter, he already is considering her as part of the extended family of the clan, because she had been married to Mahlon, and she was the daughter-in-law of Elimelech and Naomi. And so he was beginning to treat her as a member of the clan, although the age difference, Boaz was probably in his 90s by this time, and Ruth would have been in her mid-20s, probably around 25-ish. And so he's talking to her like he would talk to a daughter. And so he said, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field, and do not go from here. Now, why would he say that? Because he understood the cultural animosity toward Moabites around the area, particularly at that time. So he says, look, you're safe here, stay here. Don't go glean another field. Don't go from here but stay here close to my young women. And again, that's the same word in Genesis 2:24. Yeah, Genesis 2:24, where it says when a man marries a woman that he will cleave to his wife, he will be joined to his wife. It's the same word used in Ruth 1:14 when it says Ruth clung to Naomi. In other words, he's being very, very pointed here with his vocabulary. He's not saying, you know, kind of hang around my women somewhere. He's like, they're my young women. You cling to them. You stay with them. You stick close to them. If you want to stay safe, you're going to stay close to these young women. And so he's really exerting himself as a caretaker at this point. And here again, Boaz, who was raised by Rahab, the prostitute, the harlot, the Canaanite, you know, has a concern for this Moabite woman. And he's concerned on a level of human being. She's a human being. She's a person. She needs help. She needs to be cared for. There's no prejudice in his heart. And as Christians, that's where we've always got to be. There's no prejudice in our heart. We move forward. We take care of people. You know, and he says, cling to my young women. Verse 9, let your eyes be on the field that they reap and go after them. And again, he couldn't say go with them, because they're harvesting and Ruth's the gleaner. So he's saying you stay as close as you can and go after them, follow after them. Have not I commanded the young men not to touch you? Again, because Ruth was a Moabite, every person kind of has their own sensibilities, their own prejudices. So Boaz wants to make sure that none of his workers has an animosity against Ruth, against a Moabite, that would cause them to do or say anything that would endanger or hurt her. So in this particular case, the word touch is the same idiom as the word touch in 1 Corinthians 7:1, where it says it's good for a man not to touch a woman, meaning to touch her sexually. So basically what he's saying is, have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? It means that he wasn't really worried that they were going to go over and beat her up. They were worried they'd go over and sexually assault her. And that's what he means. And then he makes this really interesting statement. When you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from that which the young men have drawn. So we know from the other places in the scripture that there was a well by the gate of Bethlehem. That could have very easily been a mile away. And so Boaz is saying, look, if you get thirsty, you know, and it was the job of the young women in the culture to draw water. And yet he says here, the young men have drawn. Now, he may have just been making a general statement. My tendency to believe is to believe that the young women and the young men kind of teamed up to get water, that the young women would draw it. But if it's a mile walk or so with water and water's heavy, that the young men probably carried it from Bethlehem to the field. It's a guess, but I think it's logical. But that's probably why he would say that go and drink from the vessels of the water which the young men have drawn, when culturally the young men would not have actually drawn the water, the young women would have. And the fact that water in that part of the world, especially this is the barley harvest, so it's the start of the dry season. It's not going to rain for 6 months. So water is precious and carefully guarded. And a lot of times people became, you know, very jealous of their water and they wouldn't share it. And the fact that Boaz says, you know, hey lady, if you get thirsty, just go drink of the water that my young men have drawn. And see that some of his workers, if you had a prejudice against Moabites, might have taken offense to that. You know, we carried that water over a mile and she's going to drink it all up, you know. And Boaz just says, hey, you know, just go, if you're thirsty, go drink of the water. They're my young men. I pay them. They got the water here. You can drink it. And he's just taking care of her. And again, you can just see his noble character. Wow, coming out. She responds beautifully. says she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground. And that's exactly what happened. And by the way, that was the act of worship. And had this happened in front of Yahweh instead of in front of Boaz, the translation would have been she fell on her face and worshiped him. And I've read some commentaries that go that way, at least in their commentary on the text. But the word for bowed herself to the ground is the word that when we read translations of the Bible and it's done in reference to Yahweh, the same word is translated worshiped. And people will read the Old Testament and they'll say, well, you notice if you worship, you only worship Yahweh. So you can only do that in English. You can't do that in Hebrew. Because if you were going to translate the Hebrew more literally, it would be that she fell on her face and worshiped him. But we don't say that because people don't understand it. What's actually happening here is she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground, and that's what people did to worship Yahweh. When it says that so-and-so fell on his face and worshiped Yahweh, he fell on his face and bowed himself to the ground. And that's what's going on. And it's a spontaneous thing. She is so astounded that this is going on for her. And again, this is the invisible hand of God behind the scenes taking care of her. And the invisible God behind the scenes takes care of us in so many situations that we don't know or understand. And we've got to keep praying that that'll continue. I mean, he said, stay close to my women. I've commanded the men not to touch you. And if you get thirsty, you can have some of my water. And she just goes whap right on her face in that culture. She's just so astounded, so totally caught off guard by this act of generosity and largess. She doesn't even know what to do with it. But she falls right on the ground in front of him and she says, why have I found favor in your eyes? And that's an honest question, and she says that you should take notice of me since I am a foreigner. And notice she didn't say Moabite. She just said foreigner. So she's like, what? I don't understand, my Lord, I don't understand what is this notice of me? And it was such an honest question and it came out of such a humble heart. And look at the response of Boaz. He'd say an arrogant person at this point would just say, well, I'm just a nice guy. That's just the way I am. And that would have been the end of it. But Boaz isn't that way. He's such a man of noble character. He's such a humble man. And he just says, he answers your question. It has been told, yes, told to me. And he repeats the word told and using the figure polyptoton for emphasis. In other words, I've heard, I've been told, really told about what you've done for Naomi. See, all you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. You've had personal tragedy too. And how you've left your father and mother in the land of your birth and have come to a people that you did not know before. And so he answers Ruth's question. And then he says, may Yahweh repay your work and a full reward be given to you from Yahweh, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. And using Yahweh in the metaphor of a bird, it's the figure hypokatastasis, but it works out basically the same. He's implying God as a bird who has big wings and cares for people under his wings. So he says, may Yahweh repay your work and a full reward be given to you from Yahweh. And this is huge, that, when we work for Yahweh, we can expect a full reward. And Boaz, Boaz was no doubt thinking in terms of a reward here on earth in this life. But in the background of his thinking and in his heart, as he'd prepared his heart over years, he was well of the understanding that there was going to be another life and that you would be repaid in the next life for what you did in this one. And that's something that every Christian needs to keep in mind. There's another life coming, and we're going to be repaid in that next life according to what has happened and what we have done in this life. And that's one of the reasons why we want to be aggressive Christians, because we get repaid in the next life for what we've done in this one. In verse 13, then Ruth said, let me find favor in your eyes, my Lord, because you have comforted me and because you have spoken to the heart of your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your female servants. And it's important that we catch both phrases here in Ruth 2:13, because you've comforted me. Because when he says, I want you to stay close to my women, and I want you to, I've commanded the men not to protect you, not to touch you, and I don't want you to go into another field. Here's Ruth. She's leaving to glean early in the morning with Naomi's permission. She's not thinking she's probably going to get much. She's probably going to be driven out of a number of fields before somebody finally allows her to glean, and she's going to get, a little bit and take it home. And now all of a sudden Boaz has completely opened his heart and his field to her, and she's realizing Naomi and I are going to eat. We're going to be okay. If you're facing starvation or possible starvation, or certainly possible hunger, the fact that that somebody's going to take care of you and make sure you have food to eat, that's inestimable comfort. And she's like, wow, this is really comforting. And you've spoken to my heart. You've spoken tenderly to me about my protection and my well-being, whether it's being protected from young men or being protected in the sense that I won't be really hot and thirsty here in the field, that I can go get some water. I mean, it's just amazing. And she reflects this in what she says. Verse 14, and at mealtime, which means that Boaz had regular meal breaks for his workers. Again, that could be unusual. If you had a mean, nasty worker, a boss, he'd just drive you. But at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here. Now, Ruth was probably staying off at a distance. Boaz, and again, we see the character of Boaz. He's eating with his workers. He doesn't have to. Boaz could have been having roast lamb 150 yards away while the workers sat down and ate grain by the handful. Boaz was a really genuinely noble man, and he's eating with his workers. No wonder they liked him and felt a bond with him, and he with them. And then he looks, and there's Ruth, and she would respectfully keep her distance. She's not a worker. She's not a hired hand. She's not one of Boaz's workers. So, and she's not a formally part of the family. So she would have kept her distance and probably just eating some of the handfuls of the grain that she just had gleaned. And Boaz calls her over, come here. And she sat close enough to him that he could pass her food. I mean, this is astounding in that culture. Come here and eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the wine vinegar. So he provided wine vinegar for the people. By the way, the vinegar in the biblical culture was not our apple cider vinegar. It was wine vinegar. It's probably that would be, by the way, the kind of wine vinegar that was on the stick that they offered to Jesus Christ when he was on the cross. And it says they dipped the sponge in vinegar. It would have been wine vinegar, not our apple cider vinegar. It's important to get that. So dip your piece of bread in the wine vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and Boaz, passed roasted grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left over. But Boaz was so good at taking care of her that he made sure she had some grain left over. And then verse 15, and when she got up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Now the sheaves, as the men cut the grain, as they cut a handful or two, then they would wad it together, pull it together in a tight bundle, and take a stalk of grain and wrap it around the outside and tie it off, and then drop that, and that would be a little bundle of sheaves, and it would sit on the ground, and then the women would come behind and they would pick up the sheaves and put them in their little, their cloak or whatever, and carry them off to the cart where the grain sheaves were taken, where later they'd be carried to the threshing floor. So normally no farmer is going to let a gleaner glean between the sheaves that are laying on the ground, because it was too easy for one of those sheaves to break open, and then the gleaners act like, oh yeah, it was just on the ground there and it wasn't wrapped up in a sheaf. And so the people would keep the gleaners at a distance until all the sheaves were gleaned. But basically, Boaz is so concerned for her. He says, let her glean even among the sheaves and don't reproach her. And pull out, yes, pull out. Again, he uses the polyptoton, the double use of the verb. He repeats the verb twice. And pulling out, pull out some for her from the bundles and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. In other words, I want her taken care of. So make sure that when you cut that grain and you're making a sheaf, pull out some of those stalks of grain out of the sheaf and make sure there's plenty for her to glean on the ground, and don't rebuke her. Verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening. And there's no 5 o'clock quitting sign time in the Bible. And it wasn't because they didn't have watches. It was just they expected a full day's work. And so you would literally work until the evening before you stopped. And then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now the scholars argue about what an ephah is, but basically, not that this is so totally helpful, but basically what they've done is they've come down to the fact that it's between 30 and 50 pounds. So that's how much grain she would have gotten in one day. Boaz made sure there was so much grain on the ground that in one day she got between 30 and 50 pounds. And she picked it up and went into the city. Again, we look at Ruth and her character, she's not saying, I can't carry 50 pounds 2 miles into the city. That's way too hard. She's got grain for a long time, and she'll, be back the next day and the next day and the next day. So she's very thankful to have that 30 to 50 pounds. And it didn't matter how far it was into the city. She's going to pick it up and get it there. And it says her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave to her mother-in-law, what she had left over after she was satisfied. Boaz had given her so much grain to eat at lunch that she couldn't eat it all, so she saved that grain too. So now she's got this 30 to 50 pounds of grain from just one day that she's bringing home to Naomi. And she's also got leftover food from lunch. Then her mother-in-law said to her, and you've got to catch the sense of this. Her mother-in-law just, well, where did you glean today? Where have you worked? Her mother-in-law is really kind of expecting her, the normal gleaner would come home with maybe a quart of grain or something, because the harvesters, that's their food. They're going to harvest the food. They're not just going to leave a bunch of food in the field. So a gleaner didn't get much. And Naomi's expecting Ruth to maybe walk in with, what you or I might call a quart or something like that of grain. And Ruth walks in with her whole blasted mantle full, 30 to 50 pounds of grain. And Ruth, and so you've got to translate verse 19 like, what in the world happened today? Where did you go? How did this happen? Somebody cared about you. Who was it? That's really what's going on in this verse. And so verse 19, and she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, the name of the man with whom I worked with today is Boaz. And then I'll read verse 20, and that's where we'll stop for the day. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed of Yahweh. Wait, blessed of Yahweh? Where'd this come from? What happened to Mara, the bitter woman? See, verse 20 marks a tidal shift in what happens in Naomi's heart. She shifted from a follower of Yahweh to being bitter because of what happened. Now she's shifting back because of what happened. And she says, blessed of Yahweh, be the one who's not forsaken his covenant faithfulness. She's remembering Yahweh's covenant, and that godly people follow the covenant. And the Hebrew word hesed here means covenant faithfulness to the living and the dead. And she goes, the man is a close relative to us, one of our kinsmen redeemer. And I'll go into the depth of that in the next teaching on Ruth. So it's very important, though, that we begin to pick up that in verse 20 starts a tidal shift in Naomi and her feeling about life. And it's so interesting because this is so human. It would be so nice if everybody was like Job. that Job just loved God, and then all these terrible things happen. And he says, the Lord gave, the Lord took away, blessed be the name of the Lord. If everybody was solid as a rock on God through thick and thin, but almost everybody is more like Naomi, that when things are going well, God's wonderful, God's great, I love God. And when things are not going well, something's wrong with God, and God's against me, and God's unfair, and I don't like him anymore, and whatever. And, God didn't make any promises about this life being easy. In fact, he made exactly the opposite. He made a number of statements about this life being tough. And when this life is tough, we can't turn against God. He doesn't deserve it. He didn't do it. And we'll cover this more in next week's teaching. And y'all have been really wonderful to stick with me this long. But it's really important, I think, to get this understanding of the Book of Ruth. So God bless you very much, and we'll stay around and talk for as long as y'all want to.